fish, mainly bighead carp and silver carp. Those are fish that are particularly good.
This is also a man-made canal, so it's very standard shape, and we have the electric bars that bring the electricity into the water.
The clock on the largest freshwater system on Earth has been ticking for over 20 years. $607 million American dollars have burned trying to stop it. Concrete barriers, electric walls, and armies of contract fishermen pulling out 50 million pounds of invasive carp. And still, the invasion crept north. Then, in the shadows of the Illinois River, something older than the dinosaurs began quietly eating the enemy for free. Something nobody predicted in 2026. Right now, in the summer of 2026, if you drive out to the town of Joliet, Illinois, and stand along the banks of the Illinois River, you will be looking at something unlike anything else on Earth. Rising from the water is the Brandon Road Interbasin Project, one of the most ambitious invasive species barriers ever attempted. This massive system is being built for one purpose alone: to stop invasive carp from reaching the Great Lakes. Construction officially gained momentum in 2024 after nearly 15 years of planning, environmental reviews, political disagreements, and legal battles between states, federal agencies, and environmental groups. By 2026, the estimated cost had already climbed beyond $1,150 million, making it one of the most expensive wildlife protection projects in American history. It is an extraordinary amount of money focused on an extraordinary goal. Imagine spending more than $1 billion to stop a fish from swimming upstream. That is how serious officials believe the threat has become. For decades, scientists warned that if invasive carp entered the Great Lakes in large numbers, they could disrupt one of the world's largest freshwater ecosystems. Silver carp and bighead carp consume enormous quantities of plankton, the microscopic organisms that support young native fish. They grow rapidly, reproduce in huge numbers, and leave less food for native species. Silver carp have also become famous for another reason. When startled by boat engines, they launch themselves several feet into the air, sometimes striking boaters hard enough to cause serious injuries. Entire communities along rivers have learned to live with these dangerous flying fish. But officials fear the economic damage could become even greater if they establish breeding populations inside the Great Lakes. Yet, while engineers were pouring concrete and designing electric barriers, something unexpected was quietly happening beneath the surface of the river. Fisheries biologists examining the stomach contents of native predators began finding evidence that challenged years of assumptions. They discovered silver carp inside large flathead catfish. Young bighead carp appeared inside bowfin, an ancient predator that has survived since before dinosaurs disappeared. Researchers even reported carp remains inside native predatory fish, in places where few people expected them to become part of the food chain. At first, many scientists questioned the findings, checking samples repeatedly to make sure mistakes had not been made. The evidence kept pointing in the same direction. Some native predators were beginning to recognize invasive carp as prey. Around the same period, wildlife officials faced another frustrating reality. For years, government agencies had encouraged Americans to solve part of the problem by eating invasive carp. They promoted recipes, cooking demonstrations, fishing tournaments, and advertising campaigns, hoping consumers would embrace the fish. The response remained disappointing. Many people simply refused to buy seafood carrying the name Asian carp. The reputation had become too negative. So, in 2022, officials and industry partners introduced a complete rebrand. The fish would now be marketed as kopi. The species itself never changed. Only the name did. Grocery stores, restaurants, food distributors, and even some school meal programs began using the new branding in hopes that consumers would judge the product by its taste instead of its reputation. The timing created an unusual picture. On one hand, America was investing more than $1 billion into an engineering project designed to block invasive carp forever. On the other hand, biologists were discovering that native predators were slowly adapting while marketers were trying to transform the same fish into a desirable food product. It was an unexpected reminder that nature does not always stand still, while humans search for solutions. Ecosystems constantly adjust, sometimes in ways that surprise even the experts studying them. But none of this means the crisis has been solved. Native predators alone are unlikely to eliminate invasive carp populations that number in the millions, and scientists continue to argue that preventing further spread remains essential. Still, these discoveries raise a fascinating question. Did the river begin helping itself while humans were busy fighting over how to save it? To answer that, we have to travel back roughly 50 years to a decision made in the American South. A decision that seemed perfectly sensible at the time, yet quietly set one of the largest freshwater invasions in North American history into motion. The cargo that broke a continent. Back in the early 1970s, catfish farmers all across the American South were losing sleep over algae, thick green mats of the stuff blooming in their ponds every summer, choking out the fish they were trying to raise for market. They needed something biological and cheap that could eat the algae faster than the algae could grow. And in the rivers of eastern China, there was a fish that did exactly that, and did it better than any chemical or filter money could buy at the time. So a handful of Arkansas fish farmers, working alongside the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission and a couple of federal aquaculture programs, imported 4 species of carp from Asia: silver carp and bighead carp, which strain tiny plankton from the water by the mouthful; grass carp, which mow down aquatic weeds like a living lawnmower; and black carp, brought in specifically to grind up the snails that were killing farmed mussels. On paper, it was one of the most efficient pieces of biological engineering anyone had come up with in years. It was cheap, it was clean, it worked exactly as promised for its intended purpose. The trouble was one thing that nobody in the room seemed to be thinking hard enough about. Fish ponds are not sealed vaults. Rivers rise. And in 1973, and again in 1982, and then again all through the 1990s, the Mississippi Basin flooded so violently that water rolled straight over the pond levees and swept the imported carp out into open water. Dwayne Chapman, a biologist with the United States Geological Survey who has spent nearly 30 years chasing these fish across the American Midwest, has told reporters that the carp did not escape because of one single bad flood. They escaped in wave after wave across almost 2 decades, from fish farms and sewage treatment ponds all across the southern basin. By the middle of the 1980s, silver carp and bighead carp had escaped into the wild and were spreading through rivers across Arkansas, Missouri, and Kentucky. What began as a local problem quickly became a regional invasion. By the mid-1990s, they had followed connected waterways into the Missouri River, the Ohio River, and eventually the Illinois River, placing them on a direct path toward the Great Lakes. Their rapid success came down to one simple advantage. These fish entered an ecosystem that was completely unprepared for them. Native predators had never evolved to hunt large invasive carp, and few diseases naturally kept their populations in check. At the same time, American rivers were rich in plankton, the tiny plants and animals that silver and bighead carp filter from the water for food. With abundant food, almost no natural enemies, and ideal breeding conditions, their numbers exploded at a pace few scientists had predicted, transforming entire river systems within just a few decades. They had no memory of fear, so they did what any animal does when it walks into paradise. They grew, they multiplied, and they took everything they could. A single female silver carp can release up to 2 million eggs in one spawning season. Read that number again slowly. 2 million eggs from one fish in one single year. Multiply that across a river system that suddenly had nothing to stop it. By the year 2010, in some pools of the Illinois River, silver carp had come to make up more than 70% of the total fish biomass in the water. Not 70% of the fish you could see. 70% of the entire weight of every living thing swimming in that river. And they were headed north, straight for the single vulnerable door that opened into the largest freshwater lakes on the planet. What happened next would drag half a dozen state governors, a sitting president, and one of the strangest interstate lawsuits in modern American history straight into the middle of a fish story. The door we could not close. In the summer of 2010, a lawyer sitting in the Michigan Attorney General's office in Lansing was drafting a lawsuit against the state of Illinois. The suit was, in its plain reading, almost absurd. It was asking a federal court to force Illinois to physically close the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, to seal off a working commercial waterway that moved billions of dollars of freight every single year. And Michigan was not doing this alone. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and New York all joined in. And what followed became one of the most extraordinary interstate fights over an environmental threat in American history. The reason those states were willing to do something that drastic sits inside one number. The Great Lakes support a commercial and recreational fishing economy worth roughly $7 billion every year. Add in tourism, boating, coastal real estate, and everything else the lakes prop up, and you are looking at a regional economy worth over $60 billion annually. If silver carp and bighead carp got into Lake Michigan and did there what they had already done to the Illinois River, the fear at the time was that the entire Great Lakes food web could unravel inside a single decade. Cameron Davis, who at the time served as senior advisor on the Great Lakes to the Environmental Protection Agency, told reporters in 2010 that in his professional career he had never seen a single threat to the lakes taken this seriously by this many states at the exact same moment. President Obama personally weighed in. His administration allocated close to $80 million in emergency funding just to hold the line on the Chicago Canal system. Rahm Emanuel, then serving as White House Chief of Staff, later admitted publicly that inside the West Wing they were treating the carp threat as a slow-motion economic emergency for the entire upper Midwest. Here is the piece the popular history tends to skip past. The reason the Great Lakes are even connected to the Mississippi Basin in the first place is because of a decision the city of Chicago made in the year 1900 to reverse the natural flow of the Chicago River. They did it to flush the city's sewage away from Lake Michigan and down into the Illinois River system. Chicago solved a public health nightmare in 1900 by physically breaking a natural drainage barrier that had held for 10,000 years. And 110 years later, that broken barrier had become the single greatest vulnerability in the largest freshwater system on the entire planet. Everybody with any expertise knew it, and nobody had a good answer for how to actually close it back up without shutting down American commerce and destroying the economies of half a dozen states. The Supreme Court eventually refused to force Illinois to close the canal, but the political pressure the lawsuit generated changed everything downstream of that ruling. It moved carp defense from a regional science project into a full-blown federal emergency almost overnight. That is when the money started to move in ways nobody had ever seen before in an environmental fight. Money on a scale that even people who work inside federal agencies were quietly uncomfortable saying out loud in public. And what that money actually bought us, once it hit the water, is a story most Americans have somehow never heard. The bill nobody wants to pay. According to a peer-reviewed cost analysis published in the year 2020 by the researchers Pachowski, Chapman, and Love, federal and state agencies had by that point poured $607 million into managing invasive carp across the Mississippi and Great Lakes basins.
Illinois River, about 30 miles south of Chicago, whether or not to spend untold billions of dollars separating the Great Lakes from the Mississippi River Basin.
And the researchers themselves were very careful to say, right there in the paper, that this number was almost certainly a floor. The real total, once you factor in contractor time, unaccounted research grants, state agency salaries, and the ongoing costs since 2020, is very likely well past $1 billion by the summer of 2026. So what did all that money actually buy the American public? It bought 3 electric dispersal barriers running across the width of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, pumping 15,000 volts of pulsed direct current straight into the water. Anything with a nervous system that swims into that electric field turns around, or it dies where it is. The Army Corps built them. The Coast Guard patrols them, and there have been multiple close calls, publicly reported, where operator error briefly took a barrier offline for hours at a time while agency officials sweated in Washington. It bought us the entire Brandon Road project, downstream in Joliet, which is the layered defense mentioned at the start of this story. Bubble curtains built into the concrete, underwater sound cannons blasting low-frequency noise, a flushing lock designed to sweep tiny larval fish back downstream, and a second electric barrier stacked on top of everything else. Current projections have that full build coming in over $1,150 million by the time it is fully completed later this decade. And it bought us people. Real, working, weather-beaten commercial fishermen contracted directly by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, paid by the pound to pull carp out of the river with gill nets and trammel nets. Companies like Schaefer Fisheries out of Thompson, Illinois, and Two Rivers Fisheries down in Kentucky have been the boots on the ground for well over a decade now. And their haul is genuinely staggering to sit with. Over the last 15 years alone, those crews have hauled roughly 50 million pounds of invasive carp out of the Illinois River. If you count the wider basin over the last 25 years, the number climbs past 100 million pounds. That is the weight of 10,000 African elephants pulled from a single river system, one net at a time. And it worked, in the specific and limited way that a siege works. In the upper reaches of the river, closest to Lake Michigan, the constant pressure held the line and stalled the advance for years at a stretch. But everyone involved, from Kevin Irons at the Illinois DNR down to the field technicians riding the boats at 4 in the morning, quietly told the same story to anyone who bothered to listen. This was containment. It was not victory. The moment the money stopped flowing, the carp would come roaring back within a single spawning season. Something else was going to happen. Something the budgets could not draw up in a spreadsheet. And in a muddy backwater channel of the Mississippi River, not too far from a town called Alton, a biologist with a stainless steel gutting knife was about to stumble onto the first piece of that something else. The giant nobody was watching. The biologist's name was Jason DeBoer, and he was working out of the Illinois River Biological Station, which sits under the wing of the Illinois Natural History Survey. He was studying blue catfish in the lower Illinois River and the upper Mississippi, in a stretch of water known as the Alton Pool. Blue catfish are the single largest catfish species in North America. Grown adults routinely hit 40 and 50 pounds without anybody blinking. The world record blue catfish, caught in the year 2011 out of Kerr Lake on the Virginia and North Carolina border, weighed 143 pounds. And these fish will eat almost anything they can fit inside a mouth the size of a 5-gallon bucket. For most of the last 20 years, when researchers wrote papers about invasive carp and native predators, they mostly talked past the blue catfish entirely. The consensus across the field was that adult silver and bighead carp were simply too big and too fast for any native fish in the river to bother trying to swallow. Blue catfish were assumed to be feeding on the same things they had always been feeding on. Smaller native fish, crawfish, whatever came easy in a muddy channel. Jim Lemaire, who runs the Illinois River Biological Station and has spent his entire career on this water, has said publicly that even his own team went into the DeBoer gut content studies expecting to find almost nothing carp-related in adult blue catfish stomachs. What DeBoer's team actually found, when they started opening those catfish up, stopped everyone cold in that laboratory. Silver carp were not just showing up in the diets of these blue catfish. Silver carp were the single largest component of the diet by weight in the entire study, and they were turning up inside roughly 70% of the stomachs the team examined. 70%. Some of those carp were fully grown 3-foot-long adults. The catfish were swallowing them whole, tail first, exactly the way a snake swallows something twice the size of its own skull. When you first hear that number, you feel a little bit ridiculous on behalf of the entire country. All that money, all those barriers, all the political fighting and interstate lawsuits and White House emergency funds, and quietly, downstream, without anybody telling it to, a Native American giant had already added the invader to its normal grocery run. What we did not know at the time, and what almost nobody has written about since, is that blue catfish populations in the Illinois River have actually been climbing steadily over the last 15 years. Nobody stocked them. Nobody bred them for this specific purpose. They responded to a river suddenly full of food they could catch, and their numbers rose to meet the abundance. Biologists have a name for that. They call it a functional response. A predator meeting a food source. It is old behavior. It is the way rivers have always worked, when we get out of their way long enough to let them work at all. Even a 100-pound catfish has limits, though. And in the shallow, muddy backwaters where the story gets even stranger, another native predator was already waiting patiently. One that we deliberately exiled from this river more than half a century ago. One that we called a monster, then a menace, then a mistake we could not afford to have made in the first place. The ghost we killed and called back. The last alligator gar caught in the state of Illinois, before the extinction was made official, came out of the Cache River in the far southern tip of the state in the year 1966. That fish, according to the records held at the Illinois Natural History Survey, was the final period at the end of a sentence America had been writing on this species for almost 70 straight years. It was hated. To look at a full-grown alligator gar is to look at something that has no business surviving into the 20th century. 8 feet long, 300 pounds, armored in scales so hard that Native American communities across the lower Mississippi Basin used them as arrowheads. 2 rows of teeth set in a jaw the length of your entire forearm. Bass fishermen called the alligator gar a trash fish. Duck hunters shot them out of boats for entertainment. State agencies across the Midwest actively encouraged their killing, working off the theory that they were eating too many game fish that hunters wanted for themselves. By the middle of the 1960s, from Illinois north through Missouri and Kansas, we had scrubbed the alligator gar out of its entire northern range. We deliberately erased the biggest freshwater predator in the middle of North America because we thought we knew better than 10,000 years of river biology. Then, in the 2010s, the regret finally started to set in. Rob Hilsebeck, at the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, took the lead on what became one of the strangest and most quietly emotional reintroduction programs in modern American conservation. Starting in the year 2010, the Illinois DNR began raising juvenile alligator gar in state hatcheries, using brood fish collected from healthy populations down in Louisiana that still remembered how to be alligator gar in the wild. From 2010 through 2025, Illinois stocked more than 21,000 alligator gar into a dozen different water bodies across the state.
This is the alligator gar, doing a reintroduction program in Illinois. So this is one of 300 alligator gar that are being stocked into Horseshoe Lake today.
That includes the Cache River itself, the very stream where the last one was caught and killed in the year 1966. The tagged fish are being tracked steadily in the water. The population is holding, and Rob Hilsebeck has been very careful in public interviews to say that the goal was never to build a carp-killing weapon. The goal was to fix an old, self-inflicted wound in the river. Solomon David, who is one of the leading gar biologists in the country and now runs a research lab at the University of Minnesota Duluth, has been very vocal in his interviews with National Geographic and Hawkeye magazine that the alligator gar is one of the only native fish in the entire Mississippi Basin with a mouth genuinely big enough to swallow a fully grown adult silver carp. He is also honest that the gar alone will never outbreed the invasion by itself. But he has said, more than once, that returning a large native predator to a river system it has been missing from for over half a century does something that statistics genuinely struggle to describe with numbers. It puts back a piece of the food web that was doing this work for 10,000 years before any of us ever showed up with fishing rods and dredges. And that piece is starting, quietly and patiently, to eat again. That is only 2 of the 3 defenders. The third one is older than nearly anything else swimming in North America right now, and it lives in the shadows. The chorus in the shadows. The bowfin's lineage runs back over 150 million years, into an age when dinosaurs still walked the shorelines of the shallow inland sea that once covered most of the American middle. Every other member of its ancient biological order is completely gone from the planet, known to modern science only from fossils pressed into stone. The bowfin alone still swims. It breathes air, gulping oxygen at the water's surface through a primitive lung. And that is not a small biological detail buried in a textbook. It lets the bowfin survive in warm, oxygen-starved backwaters where almost every other fish species suffocates and dies, which turns out to be a very serious problem for invasive carp, because juvenile silver and bighead carp settle into exactly those kinds of shallow backwaters as they grow through their first summer of life. In the year 2022, a team of biologists led by Solomon David published a landmark study that formally split the bowfin into two separate species. The northern form kept the old scientific name Amia calva. The Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi form, which lives right in the heart of the carp invasion zone, got a brand new scientific name of its own, Amia otselicoda. It was a small paper that made almost no mainstream news at the time. But biologists who know this fish understood immediately what it meant. There is more of this ancient predator, in more forms, in more places, than we had ever been giving it credit for. When the Illinois Natural History Survey started opening bowfin stomachs, they found something very familiar: juvenile silver carp and bighead carp in real quantity. But the bowfin is not fighting alone in those backwaters. Field studies out of Western Illinois University and the Illinois Natural History Survey have documented juvenile invasive carp turning up in the stomachs of largemouth bass, white bass, black crappie, channel catfish, freshwater drum, yellow perch, and short-nosed gar. In controlled experiments, when researchers offered white bass and short-nosed garay real choice between native prey and juvenile carp, both species actively preferred the invader on the plate. Nobody trained them. Nobody incentivized them with treats. The river is doing this by itself. Scientists have a name for this behavior. They call it biotic resistance. The way a native ecosystem quietly pushes back through hunger, competition, and predation, without ever asking for our permission or a federal grant. On top of all of that, in the summer of 2022, the Illinois DNR launched the coffee rebrand across the entire Midwest. Grocery chains now stock it. Chicago restaurants serve it plated with lemon. School districts run it through their cafeteria lines. Every single pound of coffee that gets eaten by an American is one more pound of pressure on the invasion applied by our own dinner plates. Human appetite has finally joined the food web against the invader we imported. So here is where we actually stand in the summer of 2026. The electric barriers hum steadily. Brandon Road climbs toward completion. The catfish keeps feeding. The gar keeps growing. The bowfin keeps waiting in the weeds. For the first time since this invasion started, in the upper pools of the Illinois River, native plankton populations are actually rebounding measurably. That is the base of the entire food web coming back. The single most hopeful sign a working river biologist can be given in a case like this one. The river is quietly remembering how to defend itself. And we are finally, slowly, learning how to let it do the work. I want to hear from you now. Do you think we are watching a river genuinely win back what we took from it? Or is this just a temporary reprieve before the next invasion? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.